Google does not make mistakes with dates. That is not a marketing claim. That is the operational foundation of a company worth more than $2 trillion. Their entire cloud infrastructure, their entire legal defensibility in criminal courts across the United States, their entire relationship with law enforcement depends on one thing. When Google says a file was created on a specific date, that date is accurate. Billions of photos, trillions of timestamps. Every time your phone tells you a picture was taken at 3:47 p.m. on March 15th, Google got that right. Every time a prosecutor walks into a courtroom with Nest camera footage and tells a jury, this image was captured on this date at this time, the jury believes it because Google's systems verified it. So when Google tells investigators that a specific file from a specific camera at a specific address was timestamped January 11, 2026, that is not a guess. That is a confirmed forensic fact pulled from encrypted cloud servers, cross-referenced against redundant storage systems, verified by engineers whose entire professional existence depends on that data being correct. The FBI believed it. They launched a neighborhood-wide canvass. They went door to door asking every resident in Nancy Guthrie's community for surveillance footage from that exact date. They cross-referenced cell tower data. They built an entire investigative theory around a planned multi-week operation that began 3 weeks before an 84-year-old woman vanished from her home. Then Google called back. We can't confirm for sure that the date is January 11. No technical explanation. No error report. No specific reason. Just uncertainty where there had been certainty. For 7 weeks, no one publicly understood why one of the most sophisticated technology companies in the world reversed a timestamp confirmation in the middle of an active federal investigation. Then Sheriff Chris Nano sat down with NBC News on March 23, 2026, and revealed what investigators had been sitting on since the beginning. What he said raises a question more disturbing than the contradiction itself. If Google cannot trust their own timestamps in a case this critical, what can we trust? This video is based on publicly available information, court records, official statements, and expert analysis. Some elements discussed are theoretical scenarios exploring possibilities in an unsolved case. All individuals are innocent unless proven guilty in a court of law. Who is Nancy Guthrie? Nancy Agnes Guthrie was born on June 24, 1941, in Tucson, Arizona. She spent 84 years in the community she loved, raising a family that would eventually include one of America's most recognized journalists, her daughter Savannah Guthrie, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show. But to those who knew Nancy in Tucson, she was not defined by her famous daughter. She was defined by her independence, her sharp mind, and her fierce love of privacy. At 84, Nancy lived alone in her home in the Catalina foothills, a quiet, affluent neighborhood east of downtown Tucson, where the streets wind through desert terrain and neighbors are separated by considerable distances. She managed her own life. She drove herself to appointments. She maintained the mental clarity of someone decades younger. Her family told investigators, Mom was sharp. She would never have just wandered off. Nancy Guthrie was not someone who disappeared without cause, and everything about what happened to her suggests that whoever took her knew that. Before we get into what Google told investigators and why their story changed, we need to understand the neighborhood where this happened, because the Catalina foothills is not just the backdrop of this case. It is a critical part of why January 11th matters. The Catalina foothills sits at an elevation above the main grid of Tucson. Homes in this area range from $500,000 to several $1 million. The streets are wide, tree-lined, and quiet. Traffic at night is almost non-existent. A vehicle parked on one of those residential streets at midnight would be noticed by almost no one, because there is almost no one around to notice it. But it is also a neighborhood with extraordinary surveillance density. Ring cameras, Nest systems, Arlo setups mounted above garage doors, cameras pointed at driveways, at front walks, at the street. A neighborhood where nearly every home has multiple recording devices operating around the clock. In theory, any person who moved through those streets on January 11, 2026, could have been captured by multiple independent camera systems within seconds of each other. A vehicle making a single pass down the street nearest Nancy's home could have been recorded by 4 or 5 different cameras belonging to 4 or 5 different neighbors who had no idea they were documenting a reconnaissance visit. That is exactly what the FBI was trying to build. A visual trail. A pattern that connected January 11th to February 1st. The same vehicle, the same route, the same person. 2 separate visits, 21 days apart, captured by neighbors' cameras and stitched together into an evidence chain that a jury could follow. But to build that trail, you need timestamps you can trust. And that is where the problem begins. Now let's talk about what Sheriff Nanos finally revealed. Since February 1st, the FBI had been asking Nancy Guthrie's neighbors for something very specific. Not footage from the night she disappeared. Not video from the week before. Footage from January 11, 2026, 21 days before Nancy vanished. Neighbors complied. They checked their Ring doorbells, their driveway cameras, their Nest systems, but no one understood why that date mattered. The sheriff's office wouldn't comment. The FBI stayed silent. Then on March 22, 2026, 50 days after Nancy disappeared, the Guthrie family released a statement that included, for the first time, a direct public plea. They asked anyone with video footage or information from January 11, 2026 to come forward. The next day, Sheriff Nanos explained why. In an interview with NBC News, Nanos disclosed something that had been held back from the public for 7 weeks. Google Nest cameras were installed at Nancy Guthrie's home. When investigators requested data from Google, the company's engineers analyzed the files, examined the metadata, and cross-checked their cloud server logs. According to Sheriff Nanos' statement to NBC News, they came back with a specific finding. One of the photos or videos was timestamped January 11th, not an estimate, a specific timestamp pulled from Google's cloud servers, verified by their systems, and reported to investigators as confirmed digital evidence. For law enforcement, the implication was immediate. Someone had been on Nancy's property on January 11th. The abduction was not random. This was planning. This was surveillance. Someone had been studying Nancy, observing her routine, preparing for what would happen 3 weeks later. The FBI launched a canvass. They went door to door in Nancy's neighborhood, asked residents to check their cameras for footage from January 11th, built a timeline, cross-referenced cell tower data, and constructed a theory of a multi-week planned operation. Then Google changed the story. At some point, after providing that initial timestamp, Google contacted investigators again. Their message: "We can't confirm for sure that the date is January 11th. Sheriff Nanos didn't elaborate on why Google walked back their assessment. NBC News didn't press for technical details. Google issued no public statement about the discrepancy, but the implications are significant. Google Nest is a multi-billion-dollar platform used in millions of homes. Their cloud infrastructure is designed to be tamper-proof, encrypted, and legally defensible. When Google provides a timestamp in a criminal investigation, law enforcement relies on it. Prosecutors cite it. Defense attorneys challenge it. Judges instruct juries to evaluate it. So when Google says, "We can't confirm the date," it means one of two things. Either their technology failed in a way that is extremely rare, or they discovered something about that specific file that made them question its integrity. Let's examine both possibilities. Digital files can become corrupted during upload, storage, or transmission. If the timestamp data was damaged, Google's systems might have initially misread it. Upon deeper forensic analysis, they discovered the corruption and realized the date was unreliable. But Google's systems are designed to detect corruption. They run integrity checks. They validate metadata before reporting it. For a corrupted file to slip through those checks and be reported to law enforcement as verified represents a significant system failure, not a routine technical hiccup. A second possibility: Nest cameras sync time using network time protocols. If there was a time zone discrepancy, especially around daylight saving time transitions, the displayed date could be off. But January 11th to February 1st is 21 days. Not 1 hour, not 24 hours. 3 weeks. A time zone error does not explain that gap. A third possibility: sometimes cameras record footage offline and upload it later when they reconnect to the internet. If Nancy's camera was offline on January 11th but reconnected on a later date, Google's servers might have confused the upload timestamp with the recording times. This is plausible, but if this were the issue, Google could explain it clearly. The footage was recorded on an uncertain date and uploaded on January 11th. According to reports, they didn't say that. They said they can't confirm for sure. That specific phrasing suggests something more complex than a simple upload discrepancy. Now let's consider the more troubling explanations. One scenario observers have raised: Google's forensic team discovered that the January 11th file had been altered. Not by an external hacker, by someone with physical access to the camera system. If someone deleted footage and re-uploaded it, or if they reset the camera's internal clock, the metadata could be manipulated. Google's systems are designed to detect this kind of tampering. But detecting it and proving it definitively in court are two different things. If Google found evidence of manipulation but couldn't establish it with the certainty required for legal proceedings, they might have walked back their confirmation to avoid testifying about potentially compromised evidence. There is no public evidence this occurred in Nancy's case, but if it were true, it would mean something critical. Someone had physical access to Nancy's camera system before February 1st. That person knew how to manipulate digital timestamps, and the January 11th footage might show exactly what Google initially suspected. But the timestamp is no longer reliable as courtroom evidence. This would explain why the FBI is still investigating the date. They know something happened. They just can't use Google's timestamp to prove when. Another consideration: corporate legal liability. Google confirms a date. Investigators build a case around it. An arrest is made. The defense challenges the timestamp. Google is called to testify. Under cross-examination, it comes out that Google's initial confirmation was based on automated analysis that had not been fully verified by human forensic analysts. To avoid that scenario, Google's legal team may have advised investigators. We initially reported January 11th based on automated systems, but we cannot confirm that date with sufficient legal certainty for criminal proceedings. This is not unusual corporate behavior. It is, in fact, exactly what any competent legal department would recommend in a high-profile case with enormous public visibility. What we know for certain, Google initially provided a date, then expressed uncertainty about that date. The reasons for that reversal remain undisclosed. Sheriff Nanos confirmed it happened. Google has not contradicted that account. The investigation continues. Here is an important piece of context that the coverage of Google's reversal has not adequately addressed. When a major technology company provides forensic data in a federal investigation and then walks back that data, the FBI does not simply accept the reversal and move on. They request a technical explanation. They ask for the specific reason the initial finding was modified. They ask for documentation of the analysis that produced both the original confirmation and the subsequent uncertainty. If Google provided that technical documentation, the FBI now knows exactly why the January 11th timestamp became unreliable. They know whether it was a processing error in Google's automated systems, evidence of external tampering with the camera data, or a decision by Google's legal counsel to limit their evidentiary exposure in a high-visibility case. That knowledge shapes everything about how they continue to pursue that date. If Google could not provide a technically satisfactory explanation for why they reversed a confirmed timestamp, that itself becomes a point of investigation. A timestamp that cannot be explained by any known technical failure may indicate something more deliberate than a system error. The FBI's continued focus on January 11th in the weeks after Google's reversal is the clearest public signal we have that this date has not been discredited. It is a disputed data point in an active investigation. There is a meaningful difference between those two things. Now let's talk about what 21 days actually means in the context of this case, because the gap between January 11th and February 1st is not arbitrary. It is a specific window of time that tells us something specific about who did this. 21 days is enough time to learn a target's routine. When she leaves the house, when she returns, when she is alone. What time the lights go off. What time any regular visitors arrive and depart. 21 days is enough time to map a property, where the cameras are positioned, what angles they cover, where the blind spots are, the best approach vector that minimizes camera exposure while maintaining a clear path to the front door. 21 days is enough time to identify security vulnerabilities. Does she lock her doors from the inside? Does she set an alarm? What wireless systems are present? What frequencies they operate on? What equipment would be needed to neutralize them? 21 days is enough time to plan entry and exit routes, where to park a vehicle so it is not captured on any residential cameras, the fastest path out of the neighborhood onto arterial roads, the route to any waiting location, safe house, or border crossing. 21 days is enough time to coordinate with additional participants, if multiple people were involved, to assign roles, to rehearse the operation, to acquire specialized equipment, radio frequency jammers, multiple layers of protective gloves, head-mounted lighting to keep both hands free, tools to disable cameras without leaving physical evidence. 21 days is the difference between impulse and precision, and everything about February 1st was precision. Rick Castigar spent 46 years with the Pima County Sheriff's Office. He was Sheriff Nanos' superior for 37 of those years. He has seen hundreds of crime scenes. He knows what professional criminal behavior looks like. And when he reviewed the footage from February 1st, he described the suspect's approach in a way that cuts directly to the question of January 11th. Castigar said, "If you watch that video carefully, you'll see him approach slowly with his right shoulder toward the camera, turning to his left with his head. That tells me he knew where the camera was. That's not something you figure out in the moment. That's preparatory work. A person who knows the exact angle of a security camera does not discover that information during the commission of a crime. They discover it during a prior visit, during deliberate observation, during reconnaissance, and January 11th is the most likely candidate for when that reconnaissance occurred." Morgan Wright, former detective and CEO of the National Center for Open and Unsolved Cases, traveled to Tucson to examine the property in person. He is a former law enforcement professional who wanted to see the physical evidence with his own eyes, not through photographs. When he walked Nancy's driveway, he noticed something about the blood evidence that changes the analysis entirely. The blood did not scatter randomly. It did not trail across the yard in a pattern consistent with a victim who fell or tried to flee. It stopped at a very specific point on the driveway, close to the street, in a concentrated pattern. Wright explained, "The blood stops at the exact point where a vehicle would be positioned, not scattered, not dragged further. It stops precisely where a car door would open. Someone parked a vehicle in exactly the right spot to minimize the distance Nancy would need to be moved. That kind of precision doesn't happen by accident. It comes from planning. from visiting the property beforehand, from knowing exactly where to position a vehicle for the fastest possible extraction. January 11th may have been when they identified that spot, between 2:12 a.m., when motion sensors detected activity inside Nancy's home, and 2:28 a.m., when her pacemaker transmitted its final signal to the monitoring network. 16 minutes passed. 16 minutes to subdue an 84-year-old woman in her own home. Move her from inside the residence to the front door. Get her out the door. Transport her across the porch where blood was later found. Load her into a waiting vehicle and exit the property. Morgan Wright was direct about what that window means. 16 minutes is too short for improvisation, but perfect for a planned operation. Only someone who knew exactly what they were doing could execute a crime in 16 minutes and leave cleanly. Rick Castigar, who has spent nearly 5 decades studying how criminals operate, reached the same conclusion. He analyzed the timeline and said, in 16 minutes, the offender had a violent confrontation with Nancy Guthrie. We know that because there's blood leading out the door. In 16 minutes, they arranged transportation and exited. That tells you there was a second person, and that tells you this was planned. The equipment recovered from the scene supports that conclusion. The suspect in the February 1st footage wore multiple layers of gloves to prevent fingerprint transfer, used a head-mounted light to keep both hands free during the operation, demonstrated knowledge of camera placement that required prior observation, and according to Castigar, possibly carried a radio frequency jamming device to disrupt wireless signals from security equipment. This is not equipment assembled on the night of a crime. This is equipment acquired over days or weeks, tested, prepared, planned, for a specific use on a specific night against a specific target. Now let's look at the evidence that the FBI may have beyond Google's disputed timestamp, because the question is not just whether January 11th is the right date. The question is why. Even after Google expressed uncertainty, the FBI continued to treat that date as significant. They did not abandon it. Mid-March reports indicated that FBI agents were still going door to door in Nancy's neighborhood, specifically requesting video from January 11th, 7 weeks after her disappearance. That is not standard procedure for a discredited lead. That is sustained investigative focus on a date they still believe matters. What corroborating evidence might give them that confidence? Cell tower data is one possibility. If a person of interest's phone was in proximity to Nancy's neighborhood on January 11th, cell tower records would show it. The FBI can correlate that data with Google's disputed footage. If a device was in that area on both January 11th and February 1st, the Google timestamp becomes less critical to the overall case theory. Neighbor surveillance is another. The Catalina foothills has extensive residential camera coverage. If even one neighbor's system captured a vehicle or a person on January 11th that matches characteristics from February 1st footage, that is independent corroboration. The FBI may have already found that match, which would explain why they are still pursuing the date, despite Google's reversal. Automated license plate recognition systems are deployed in some Tucson area communities and along major arterial roads. If a specific vehicle passed through the area on both January 11th and February 1st, that data could establish a pattern without relying on any single residential camera system. Device signal forensics represent a fourth possibility. Modern vehicles, phones, and Bluetooth-enabled devices broadcast identifiable signals that can sometimes be detected in archived network data. If a specific device signature appeared near Nancy's home on January 11th and again on February 1st, that is pattern evidence that exists independently of any camera time. The Guthrie family's decision to mention January 11th publicly in their March 22nd statement is itself a signal. Families in active investigations do not volunteer specific dates to the public unless investigators have told them that doing so may produce useful tips. The family did not explain where the date came from or why it mattered. They simply asked the public for help. That means investigators told them, this date is still important. We need more information. Ask the community. Even after Google's reversal, even with the uncertainty, the FBI believed January 11th was significant enough to involve the family in a public request for corroboration. That is not investigators working a dead lead. That is investigators who have evidence we have not seen. Before we get to theories, let's establish something that forensic analysts have pointed out, and that the public reporting has largely glossed over. The pacemaker disconnect at 2:28 a.m. is being treated as a death signal. It may not be. A cardiac pacemaker transmits monitoring data through a cellular connection. It sends regular updates to a remote monitoring network operated by the device manufacturer and connected to the patient's cardiologist. When those transmissions stop, it can mean several things. It can mean the patient died and the device ceased functioning. It can mean the device was physically removed from the patient's body. It can mean the device moved outside the range of cellular network coverage, as it would if the patient was transported into an area with no signal. such as a remote desert location or across an international border where the device's network registration is no longer valid. It can mean the device was exposed to strong electromagnetic interference of the kind that a radio frequency jammer would produce. Law enforcement and the media have implied that 2:28 a.m. represents the moment of Nancy's death. The evidence does not conclusively support that interpretation. What the pacemaker data confirms is that the device stopped communicating with the monitoring network at 2:28 a.m. What caused that communication to stop has not been publicly confirmed. This distinction matters enormously for the investigation. If the pacemaker stopped transmitting because Nancy was transported across the border or into a rural area without cellular coverage, she may have been alive much longer than the 2:28 a.m. timestamp suggests. If she was alive longer, the medical care window that Rick Castigar says the perpetrators couldn't provide was longer, which creates different scenarios for what may have happened to her. The pacemaker timestamp, like the Google timestamp, is being treated as more definitive than the underlying data actually supports. Now, let's examine the theory that has gained the most traction among former law enforcement analysts who have reviewed the publicly available information. Rick Castigar, who recommended Nanos for the position of sheriff and who has stated publicly that he regrets that decision given what has since emerged, believes this was a planned kidnapping for ransom involving at least 2 perpetrators, possibly 3. His assessment is based on 46 years of studying how criminal organizations operate in the Arizona-Sonora border region. Castigar believes Nancy was taken from her home and transported south into Mexico, where the perpetrators had resources to hold her while negotiations were initiated. The financial motive, in his analysis, was obvious. Nancy Guthrie's connection to Savannah Guthrie gave the kidnappers leverage against a family with the financial resources and the public profile to make negotiation possible. The evidence supports several elements of this theory. The level of operational sophistication, the specialized equipment, the tactical awareness of camera placement, the precision of the execution, all of these point to individuals with prior criminal experience and access to resources that casual offenders do not have. The geographic proximity to the Mexican border, approximately 80 miles from Nancy's home to Nogales, Arizona, makes a cross-border transfer logistically feasible within a 2 to 3 hour window following the abduction. The theory also has weaknesses that honest analysis requires acknowledging. In documented kidnapping for ransom cases, contact is typically made with the family within 72 hours. The longer kidnappers wait to make demands, the more risk they accumulate without generating any financial return. 51 days without any confirmed public communication from the perpetrators is unusual for a ransom operation that was supposed to leverage a connection to a nationally recognized media figure. Castigar's explanation for this silence is that something went wrong. Nancy required a pacemaker and specific medications to maintain her health. The perpetrators, in his assessment, were not equipped to provide that medical care. He believes Nancy died while in custody, not as the intended outcome of the operation, but as a consequence of withheld or unavailable medical treatment. If that is what happened, it transforms the crime from kidnapping to homicide, and it explains why no one has come forward to claim the $1.2 million reward the Guthrie family posted. The perpetrators have nothing to offer in exchange for that reward. They cannot produce Nancy alive, and leading authorities to her remains would expose them not only to kidnapping charges but to murder. The silence becomes rational when you understand it as self-preservation rather than patience. There is a second theory that has received less public attention, but that investigators have reportedly not ruled out. The theory of a targeted operation by a small, organized group with prior knowledge of Nancy's identity, her home, and her connection to a high-profile family, but with no prior criminal relationship to her directly. This theory differs from Castigar's, primarily in the origin of the intelligence. Rather than a group that identified Nancy through surveillance of her public-facing identity or her daughter's media presence, this theory posits individuals who obtained specific, actionable information about Nancy from someone with direct access to her life, a person who knew her schedule, her security arrangements, and the layout of her home from legitimate prior contact. The strength of this theory lies in the operational detail. Knowing which circuit breaker controls a specific security camera requires either prior physical access to the home, detailed knowledge from someone who has been inside the home, or an extraordinary level of surveillance that would itself likely have been captured on camera during the reconnaissance phase. The weakness is that it requires the existence of an informant, someone who provided the operational intelligence that made the February 1st execution possible, and no such individual has been publicly identified. A third possibility, which no credible analyst has dismissed entirely, is involvement by criminal networks operating along the Arizona-Sonora corridor. The region between Tucson and the Mexican border has historically been an area of operation for organized criminal groups engaged in various forms of trafficking and extortion. The sophistication of the February 1st operation specifically the use of electronic countermeasures and the tactical approach to camera avoidance, is consistent with methods documented in operations conducted by experienced criminal organizations rather than by individuals acting independently. The evidence supports elements of this theory. It also presents a significant problem. An operation against an American citizen whose daughter is a national television anchor would represent an extraordinary escalation of risk for any organization that wants to continue operating in the region without attracting the level of federal scrutiny that has followed this case. Whether that risk calculus would have been acceptable to any such organization depends entirely on the perceived financial opportunity and the confidence in operational security. The evidence supports parts of each of these theories. None of them fully explains every documented detail of what happened. What all three theories share is the requirement of planning. Significant, sustained, deliberate planning that began weeks before February 1st. Planning that required someone to be physically present at or near Nancy Guthrie's property before the night of the crime. Planning that is consistent with a reconnaissance visit on or around January 11, 2026. While investigators were pursuing the Google timestamp, a separate situation was developing that has direct implications for public confidence in this investigation. On March 25, 2026, the Pima County Board of Supervisors convened an executive session, according to the publicly released agenda. The meeting included discussion regarding recently reported issues concerning Sheriff Nanos's work history and apparent related false statements, along with related personnel management and internal affairs investigations. The board was examining allegations about whether the sheriff made false statements in official contexts. According to court records made public in recent weeks, Sheriff Nanos was reportedly suspended 8 times while employed by the El Paso Police Department in the early 1980s. Records indicate he resigned from that position in 1982 in lieu of termination. However, when he applied to the Pima County Sheriff's Office in 1984, his resume reportedly listed 1984 as his end date in El Paso, not 1982. A 2-year discrepancy that has not been publicly explained. During a deposition in a recent civil lawsuit, according to court documents, Sheriff Nanos testified under oath, "I have never been suspended as a law enforcement officer." That statement contradicts El Paso Police Department records showing 8 suspensions. These are allegations. Sheriff Nanos has not been criminally charged in connection with these statements. Rick Castigar, who spent 46 years in the department and recommended Nanos for the sheriff position, has stated publicly that he regrets that recommendation. He said, had his past been fully known in 1984 when he applied to Pima County, he would have been disqualified. 8 suspensions, and that level of disciplinary history would not have been survivable in any professional law enforcement environment I have ever worked in. Castigar also offered a direct assessment of Nanos's leadership style that speaks to the investigation's conduct. He said that on his first day as sheriff, Nanos told his staff he was going to micromanage everything, that he doesn't take other people's input, that his ego drives every decision, and in Castigar's view, that dynamic is visible in the Nancy Guthrie investigation. Castigar made a statement about the first hours of the investigation that, if accurate, represents a failure with permanent consequences. He said there was never a real search for Nancy in those early hours, but the first 18 to 24 hours were spent treating the situation as an elderly woman who had wandered away from home, and that by the time investigators recognized the evidence of violent abduction, a critical window had closed. That window matters for a specific reason. The first hours after a violent crime are what investigators call the golden period. Not because time is precious in a metaphorical sense, but because of the concrete, irreversible nature of what is lost when that period is wasted. Traffic, camera footage, overwrites on cycles of hours, not days. Cell tower data that shows which devices were in proximity to a location at a specific time is available, but requires immediate legal requests to preserve before routine deletion. Witnesses who were awake in the early morning hours of February 1st, who may have seen a vehicle, heard something, noticed something they did not immediately understand to be significant, are most accessible in the hours and days immediately following an event. Before memory begins to reconstruct and reshape itself, if 18 to 24 hours pass before investigators understood that Nancy Guthrie had not walked away from her home voluntarily, some of that evidence may no longer exist in recoverable form. That is not speculation. That is how investigative evidence works. These are serious allegations about a law enforcement leader who is currently directing an active federal investigation. The Pima County Board of Supervisors took them seriously enough to call an executive session. A recall petition targeting Sheriff Nanos has been gathering momentum. His former superior, a man who worked alongside him for decades, has said publicly that he does not have the temperament or the integrity to lead this investigation effectively. Whether those assessments are accurate is not for this analysis to determine. What is observable is the effect they have on public confidence in an investigation that depends, more than most, on community cooperation. The FBI has been asking Nancy's neighbors for help for 7 weeks. That kind of sustained community engagement requires trust, and trust in an investigation is connected to trust in the people leading it. Think carefully about what these two threads, Google's contradiction and the questions surrounding the sheriff, have in common. Both of them are about the reliability of the information we are being given. Google confirmed a date, then said it could not confirm that date. The sheriff leading this investigation has been accused of making false statements under oath about his own professional history. These are separate issues involving separate institutions, but together they describe an investigation where the foundations of the evidence and the leadership of the investigation are both under question simultaneously. In a case where a family is waiting for answers, in a case where answers may determine whether the people responsible for taking Nancy Guthrie are ever held accountable. That combination of uncertainty is not a minor procedural problem. It is a structural challenge that affects every element of what comes next. Here is where the Nancy Guthrie case stands today. No suspect has been publicly identified. No arrest has been made. No charges have been filed. 51 days of federal and state investigation, significant resources, national media coverage, and a $1.2 million reward posted by the family, and the case remains publicly unsolved. The FBI continues to be the lead federal agency on the investigation. Their presence in Nancy's neighborhood 7 weeks after her disappearance indicates they believe there are still useful leads to pursue in that immediate geographic area. Federal resources are still being dedicated to this case. The sustained door-to-door canvass requesting footage from January 11th is not the behavior of an agency that has run out of ideas. It is the behavior of an agency that has a theory they are still trying to corroborate. The Pima County Sheriff's Office, the agency with primary local jurisdiction, faces institutional questions that may affect its operational capacity and its relationship with the federal investigation. The executive session called by the Board of Supervisors represents a formal institutional review of the sheriff's leadership. At a critical juncture in the case, how that review resolves will shape the chain of command on one half of the investigative partnership. For the duration of this case, the Guthrie family continues to seek answers publicly. Savannah Guthrie has appeared in public contexts carrying the weight of her mother's disappearance, asking for community assistance, maintaining a reward that has generated no actionable public claims. The family's decision to mention January 11th in their March 22 statement was not made lightly. In active federal investigations, families are typically advised to limit their public statements to information approved by investigators. Their inclusion of that specific date indicates it was not only approved but encouraged by the FBI. Investigators wanted the public to know about January 11th. They wanted tips. They are still waiting. The $1.2 million reward that has generated no claims is itself a data point worth analyzing carefully. Rewards of significantly smaller amounts have produced credible tips in cases with far less public visibility than this one. The fact that no one has come forward in 51 days, in a case covered nationally, requires an explanation. Two explanations are possible. The first, the people with direct knowledge of what happened to Nancy Guthrie are afraid, not mildly concerned, genuinely afraid. Afraid in the way that suggests they believe coming forward would expose them to harm from people with the capability and willingness to deliver that harm. That level of fear is not associated with small-time criminal actors. It is associated with organized groups with the infrastructure and the history to enforce silence. The second, the circle of people with direct knowledge is genuinely small. 2 or 3 individuals who planned carefully, who did not share operational details with anyone outside the immediate group, who have maintained silence because the math of the situation tells them that silence is safer than any alternative. A $1.2 million reward is significant, but it is not more significant than a murder charge. And anyone who was directly involved in taking Nancy Guthrie is now, at minimum, facing felony kidnapping charges, and potentially facing homicide charges if Nancy is not found alive. For those individuals, the reward offers nothing. The risk of coming forward is total. The silence makes rational sense. Both possibilities have different implications for how this case might ultimately be resolved. But in both cases, the path to resolution almost certainly runs through physical evidence, or digital evidence that exists somewhere and has not yet been located or fully analyzed. The case that Google built and then partially walked away from, the timestamp that was confirmed, then questioned, the date that the FBI won't abandon even after the technology company that produced it expressed doubt. The 21 days between a possible reconnaissance visit and a precisely executed abduction. The 16 minutes between a motion sensor and a pacemaker going silent. The blood that stopped exactly where a vehicle door would open. All of it points toward a person or persons who planned this crime carefully, executed it with discipline, and have so far managed to remain beyond the reach of a federal investigation that has been running for 7 weeks. The Google contradiction did not destroy this investigation. but it complicated it in ways that may take months to resolve. If the January 11th timestamp was accurate, it is the most powerful evidence of premeditation in this case. If it was inaccurate, investigators need to explain why they spent 7 weeks pursuing it while other leads may have gone cold. Either outcome has consequences, and in both outcomes, Nancy Guthrie is still missing. Now it's important to step back from the data points and remember what they represent, because we have spent considerable time talking about timestamps, metadata, corporate liability, forensic analysis, cell tower data, blood spatter patterns, and the institutional credibility of law enforcement leadership. All of that matters. Every piece of it contributes to understanding what happened and what it means. But none of it is the point. The point is, a woman who is missing. Nancy Guthrie was not a timestamp. She was not a forensic data package or a cell tower record or a motion sensor reading. She was not a case file or a data point in an analysis of digital evidence. Reliability, or a footnote in a story about corporate behavior during criminal investigations. She was an 84-year-old woman who had lived in Tucson, Arizona for her entire life, who built a home in the Catalina foothills neighborhood she loved, who raised a daughter who became one of the most watched journalists in America, who had friends who called her on a February morning when she didn't answer and understood immediately that something was wrong, because Nancy always answered. She had routines that belonged to her, appointments she kept, places she went, people who expected to see her and noticed when they did not. She had a front door she walked through on the night of January 31, 2026, that she had walked through hundreds or thousands of times before. She had no reason to believe that night would be different from any other. And then someone who had been watching her, planning, preparing, took everything away in 16 minutes. Her family has spent 51 mornings waking up to the same absence. Savannah Guthrie sits down every morning to anchor a program watched by millions of people, and she does it while not knowing where her mother is. Nancy's grandchildren carry the particular weight of unanswered questions. The uncertainty that is in some ways harder than any definitive answer could be. This is not a cold case with the comfortable distance of decades. This is happening now. The people who loved Nancy Guthrie are living this in real time. A date on a calendar, January 11, 2026. Circled by investigators. Requested by the FBI. Mentioned by the family. Confirmed by Google. Then questioned by Google. 21 days before an 84-year-old woman was taken from her home and has not been seen since. A date that may hold the answer to who stood on Nancy Guthrie's porch in the early hours of February 1st and executed a plan they had been building for weeks. Or a date that, because of the uncertainty now surrounding it, may never be confirmed with the legal precision required to put someone in a courtroom. We don't know which of those outcomes is coming, because the company that provided the certainty is no longer certain, and in the space between that confirmation and that doubt, Nancy Guthrie's case remains unsolved. The digital age promised us certainty. Cameras everywhere. Data on everything. Every moment captured, encrypted, stored in servers that never sleep. We were told this technology would make crimes solvable that once would have gone forever unanswered. We were told that the era of cold cases and unidentified perpetrators was ending, because the digital record of everyday life would eventually catch everyone. The Nancy Guthrie case is a reminder that the promise and the reality are not the same thing. The technology is only as reliable as the humans and systems that maintain it. Encrypted data can be questioned. Confirmed timestamps can be reversed. The infrastructure we built to deliver certainty can, under the wrong combination of circumstances, deliver doubt instead. And when it delivers doubt in the middle of a case where a woman's life is at stake, the consequences extend far beyond a disputed cloud file. It is also a reminder that technology can be defeated by people who understand how it works. The figure who approached Nancy Guthrie's home on February 1st understood where the camera was positioned, understood how to minimize exposure, may have understood how to interfere with the wireless transmission that made the camera's footage useful as evidence. Whether that person or persons also understood how to manipulate the metadata of a file captured on January 11th is something investigators are still working to determine. What we know is that someone took an 84-year-old woman from her home in the early hours of a February morning. What we know is that this was planned. What we know is that the planning involved at least one prior visit to the property. What we know is that the date of that prior visit, January 11th, 2026, was confirmed by Google and then called into question by Google. What we know is that the FBI has not stopped pursuing that date. And what we know is that Nancy Guthrie has not been found. 51 days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, the reward remains unclaimed. The suspects remain unnamed. The date that was supposed to be the breakthrough in the case is disputed, and a family is still waiting. If you have any information about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, including anything you may have observed in the Catalina foothills neighborhood on January 11th or February 1st, 2026, the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Office are still actively seeking tips. Information can be provided anonymously. The reward remains available for anyone whose information leads to Nancy's safe return. This is not just a story. It is a real life, a real family, in a case that may still have answers waiting to be found. In a neighbor's archived footage, in a cell record that was never pulled, in the memory of someone who saw something on January 11th and has not yet understood what it means. The search for truth continues.